All right, so it's 10 a.m. and it's already 90 degrees. It's going to be a hot day today out in Golden Valley. I'm thinking of making something of the scene behind me. As usual, I'll be using the scene as inspiration. I'll be moving things around, changing the size of some of the shapes. In particular, I'm thinking the trees in the distance, maybe making them a little bigger, maybe making that distant hill a little higher. I'll be painting on a 16 by 20 inch panel, and I'll be using my usual palette of colors. Do have a few extras, quinacridone, magenta, and sap green. I've also got Indian yellow, a little bit of cadmium orange, and some cadmium red. Mapping out the big shapes using some burnt sienna thinned with odorless mineral spirits. And this tree here is a focal point. In reality, it's more of a round shape. So I am trying to make the shape a little bit more irregular so there's some interest. I've got the distant hill here or mountain, and then there's a couple more trees, and then this area here is the bright yellow mustard grass. I'm going to include the trail here in the foreground, and then I want to suggest the trail in the distance as well. Maybe little bits of it going off up the hill. This area here could use a little more definition. There's some shrubs on the hill. This will give me an opportunity to create some interesting shapes possibly here in the foreground, but also break up this little hill here, and maybe make it a bit more interesting. Actually, I want to make sure to drop down the line of this hill so that the tree breaks up this line and doesn't just touch it. I think something like that. And maybe have the bottom of the tree like right here. The sun is coming from the right, so there will be shadows, which will help to create a light effect. I mixed up a dark here using quinacridone magenta and ultramarine blue. I'm going to start off by lightly indicating my final choices as far as the lines for this tree. Lately, I've been experimenting with leaving some of these little dark bits, outlining the shape, just to create a little additional definition. You can't really see the bottom of the tree because there's some tall weeds right here. I'm going to suggest some trunks first, and then I'll start blocking in the shadow portion of the trees. I think this is actually a grouping of multiple trees here. There's another one, maybe right here. Now I'm squinting at the tree to simplify the shapes. And I was thinking today of going back to my old painting method regarding color, and see how my color experiments have affected my approach to color. My old approach to painting was faster as well, which is a good thing on a day like this because it is so hot. I'm wearing gloves and water is just dripping out, like sweat is dripping out constantly. But the sweat is a good thing because it is helping to keep me cool. I've got some water, but it is hot. You can tell already this dark scrubbing is more saturated than I would have used in the past. And there's a little bit of shadow up here as well. I'm just looking at the abstract shapes here. My old method was to work quickly, step back, and look for little bits of magic or things that are working, and then always trying to leave little spontaneous holes in the tree. So I'm liking these little openings in the tree, so I'm going to try to leave those. The tree shapes are the darkest part of the composition, so they're really going to stand out. This tree was kind of a circle shape, so I'm going to break that up a little bit. And shadow on this side, and at the bottom, shadow on this side, and along the bottom, kind of coming up a little bit like that. And these shadow shapes are just a starting point, obviously. Actually, everything that's going on here is just a starting point. A lot of green in this painting, so I'm going to define this shrub here using quinacridone magenta. Maybe I'll leave little bits of the reddish color as a complement to all of the greens. And maybe a little bit of this reddish purple along the trail. Maybe I'll add a little bit of it everywhere. The top of this hill is kind of a perfect arch almost, which normally I would try to break that up, but in some ways I like the fact that this arch plays against the irregularity of the distant hills. And a lot of times in painting or in composition, having opposites next to each other can be interesting, like warm and cool, or, you know, a straightish line with a more crooked line. I'm working dark to light, and the light portion of the trees is actually the second darkest value in the scene. I always look at trees and compare the light portion of the tree to the sky, and look how much darker it is. Actually, you could lighten it up a bit, so I'm adding some cadmium yellow lemon directly. I think one of the biggest challenges for beginning painters is to paint their trees dark enough. I think we always paint them too light. At least I did when I started. For the distant hills, I'm going with a mixture of burnt sienna and quinacridone magenta. I've been using the quinacridone magenta quite a bit, and I've also got some titanium white in the mix here. This hill is in full light, so I do want to keep it somewhat warm in temperature. For the sky, I've got a mixture of phthalo blue and titanium white. The sky does appear to be more of an ultramarine color in reality, but I find that using ultramarine does not convey a feeling of light in the sky the way phthalo or a cerulean does. I like phthalo because it's just such a powerful tint, or I should say it has incredible tinting power. So you can have a strong saturated blue at a fairly high value, which is ideal for skies. Ultramarine blue does not have as much tinting power. And there are times when that's exactly what you want. So it's nice to have both phthalo blue and ultramarine on your palette. Plus, they're different blues. The ultramarine leans towards purple, and the phthalo blue leans towards green. For the weeds along the trail here, I'm going with a blue-green color. Because there are so many greens, I want to be sure to have a variety. So for the hill here in the foreground, I added a bit of cadmium yellow medium just to warm up the mix, so there's a little bit more warmth here than here. Also, having a warmer green here will create a sense of depth. Yellow moves forward in the picture plane, and like I said, that will hopefully create a little feeling of depth. And even when I'm scrubbing in, I am using the brush strokes to define the shapes that I'm scrubbing in. In other words, this hill kind of comes down on an angle, so I'm brushing in that direction. Maybe I'll stick with the blue-green theme here in the foreground, even for these shrubs. Using a number 6 natural bristle flat. All right, next I'm going to paint in the mustard grass. I'm just going to start with pure cadmium yellow lemon, which is more of a light green than it is actually a yellow. And the mustard grass, even though it appears to be yellow, is actually more of a very light green. Now I may alter the color for compositional and artistic purposes as usual. The mustard grass color is not actually that appealing to me, but of course I can alter it to my taste. And that is what the artistic process is all about. And I can still capture the essence of this scene and this location, even if I alter my colors and values and shapes and all that. It's still going to be Golden Valley. Okay. All right, going with a light orange mixture for the trail here. I'm trying to leave little bits of the purple or the quinacridone magenta, along the trail here. Some guy just walked by and he looked at the tree and he's like, where are you seeing all that purple? And I had to kind of explain to him the artistic process. But he was not being rude, he was just genuinely curious. And I don't blame him for being curious and also somewhat baffled by my choices. Sometimes I'm baffled by my choices. All right, so at this point I'm standing back about 10 feet, just looking at the shapes. And as I mentioned before, the dark shapes are the most prominent parts of the composition. And I do like how they repeat off into the distance, but I feel like it could be good to add some dark shapes to these shrubs in the foreground just for a bit more balance. Back to my mixture of ultramarine and quinacridone magenta. And also maybe reinforce the dark on this side here. Something like that. And I want to raise up the bottom of this tree a bit more. And I'll fill this in with the mustard grass color, but I think I like that better. All right, I've got a mixture here of cadmium yellow medium and cadmium yellow lemon. Keeping my brush loaded and scrubbing on this color to adjust the color and value. I want to brighten it up a little bit, but also boost the saturation. The mustard grass is probably the most noticeable element of the scene. So I'm thinking of starting off by leaning into this color and then adjusting the other colors and values accordingly. There's a bit of dark green that is suggesting a trail, and I'm going to include that. And I may actually even add a bit of orange right here in the foreground so that it seems like the trail goes up and around, picks up here, goes around and off into the distance. A mix of titanium white and quinacridone magenta for these distant hills, and try to lighten them up and cool them off a bit to create a bit of separation. I'm using loaded strokes, and I'm applying the paint with intention, making deliberate strokes. And again, I am following the contour of the land. I want to lighten up the sky, so I'm actually applying titanium white directly to the panel and mixing with the color that's already on the panel. I know I mentioned I was going to try going back to my old painting style, but I just could not help myself. And it's not that I'm getting results that I'm entirely happy with, but I do think by doing these paintings and living with them, my perception and my taste will evolve. Whereas if I just keep painting the same thing over and over again, there's not a lot of adventure or growth in that. So I don't want to do that. I think the thing that attracts me to painting the most is making discoveries. And you can get to a point where you're a competent painter, a good painter, and you just stick with what works and you do not grow anymore. And I do not want that to happen, just because, like I said, it's just so much more fun to experiment and to be surprised. All right, so here's what I finished up with. This painting took about 2.5 hours to complete. It was finished on site. I did have my doubts about this painting when I was packing it up to go. I thought it might just be a fun experiment, but I was not sure about how I felt about the results. And so I left it in the wet panel carrier for several days. In fact, I was down in LA, I'm back up in Northern Cal, so it was, in the case for several days. But when I took it out at home, I was pleasantly surprised. So I actually do like this painting, but when I was packing it up, like I said, I had my doubts. And I think part of the reason is it just looks so different. And that's often the case when I'm exploring new techniques or a new approach. It does often take a couple days or even a few weeks or sometimes even longer until I have a clear idea about how I feel about what's going on. So at this point, I'm just trying to paint and not question, and then just live with the work and see how I feel about it. You may have heard me say this before, but I feel that the closer your painting is to looking like a photograph, the less of you is in the painting. And I think that's one of the fun things about experimenting with color and composition. The more interpretive your painting is, in other words, you're interpreting the scene, you're using the scene as inspiration, but you're not staying exactly true to it. The more you do that, the more of you is in the painting. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you'd like to see some extra videos and help support the channel, there's a Patreon link down below. I have also put a PayPal tip jar down below. If you got something out of this video and you want to pitch in, it's much appreciated. And like I said, it helps keep me making these videos. Other than that, stay creative. I'll see you guys in the next video.